Elena had mended broken bones, stitched bullet wounds, and nursed fevered drifters back from the edge of death, but never had she feared one of her patients. Not until the day she found the stranger bleeding in the desert, and learned she might be harboring the most feared Apache warrior alive. The desert had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the crunch of footsteps on dry earth and the faint whistle of wind against stone. Elena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she crossed the arroyo, the sun already clawing its way above the ridgeline. It was too early in the day for the heat to be so merciless, yet the air pressed heavy on her skin, promising another blistering afternoon. She kept her pace steady, basket in hand, eyes searching for the desert sage she meant to harvest before the sun grew unbearable. That was when she saw him dot. At first she mistook the figure for a shadow fallen against the rocks. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into a man sprawled in the dust, his chest rising shallowly, his arm twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle. Blood had dried into a dark crust along his side. The trail of it smeared across the sand where he had dragged himself and then collapsed. His lips were cracked, his face blistered with sunburn. Without a doubt, he was dying. Elena stopped dead. Her breath caught halfway between her lungs and throat. Men had died on these desert roads before bandits caught in gunfire, drifters who misjudged the heat, soldiers left behind from skirmishes no one wanted to talk about. She had seen bodies before, but this one was not yet a corpse. He clung stubbornly to life, every breath rattling like broken glass inside him. Her first thought was to turn away. It would be easier, safer. A woman alone had no business meddling with half-dead strangers, not out here where a mistake could cost her more than she was willing to pay. Yet, even as she told herself to leave, her feet moved closer. Elena was a healer. Not by choice, perhaps, but by inheritance. Her mother had carried the knowledge of herbs and remedies across the frontier, patching up anyone desperate enough to ask for help. Elena had learned those lessons at her mother's knee, listening to the way bitter leaves could cool fever and how a careful hand with a needle could stop a man from bleeding out. That duty clung to her even now, years after her mother's death. She could no more walk away from a wounded man than she could stop the desert wind. Kneeling in the sand, she pressed her hand to his neck. The pulse was faint but steady. His skin burned with fever, yet beneath the heat was a strength that startled her, the sheer will to cling to life. His clothes were torn, dusty buckskin and coarse fabric, and at his wrist hung a small band of leather threaded with beads. She didn't recognize the pattern, but the sight of it pricked something sharp at the back of her mind, a memory half-formed. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly, as though the desert might punish her for speaking too loud. His eyelids flickered. For an instant, his gaze met hers, dark, intense, startlingly lucid for a man so near death. Then the lids slid closed again, leaving her with the uneasy sense that she had just locked eyes with something more dangerous than she could name. She almost left then. Truly she did. But when she tried to rise, his hand twitched, grasping at the sand as if searching for something: water, help, salvation. The gesture was small, pitiful, yet it pierced her. Sighing, Elena reached for the water flask at her belt. She trickled a few drops onto his lips. He swallowed weakly, the movement raw but determined. "You'll die out here," she murmured. "If I leave you, the sun will finish the job before nightfall." The words sounded like an excuse, a way to justify what she already knew she would do. With a weary shake of her head, she slipped her arms beneath him. The effort nearly broke her. He was heavier than he looked, all sinew and bone, though half-starved. His blood stained her dress as she staggered upright, dragging him inch by inch toward the mule tethered at the arroyo's edge. By the time she hoisted him across the saddle, sweat slicked her skin, her breath ragged. Every instinct screamed at her, "This is a mistake. You don't know who he is. You don't know what trouble follows him." But she ignored the warning, because to abandon him would be to let him die, and Elena could not bring herself to carry that weight. When she finally got him back to her small cabin tucked against the canyon wall, the sun was high and her arms trembled from exhaustion. She laid him on her narrow bed, the beads on his wrist catching the light for the briefest moment. Something about them seemed out of place, carrying a story she wasn't ready to hear. As she gathered her needles and herbs, Elena told herself only one thing mattered. The stranger was a man in need, and she was the only one who could keep him alive. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet imagine, was that she had just invited into her home not a drifter, not a nameless wounded soul, but a warrior feared across the frontier. And once he rose from that bed, her life would never again be her own. Elena worked through the long hours of that day, binding wounds, cooling fever, and spooning drops of broth between the stranger's cracked lips. She had learned long ago that half of healing was patience, the other half stubbornness. The man had both, though fever burned through him. His body refused to surrender. Every shallow breath felt like a battle, every twitch of his jaw a refusal to die. For 2 nights and 2 days he drifted between consciousness and oblivion. In the still hours of dawn, Elena sometimes caught him muttering in a tongue she did not recognize, low, guttural syllables that carried an edge of power, as though even in dreams he wrestled with unseen enemies. Once his hand shot out and seized her wrist with startling strength, eyes snapping open like dark coals. "Water," he rasped, voice gravel scraping stone. She obeyed, lifting the cup to his lips. When he drank, his gaze never left her face. It was not the dazed look of a delirious man. No, this was sharp, wary, as though he weighed her in his mind and found her wanting. When the fever finally broke, leaving his skin clammy and his breathing steady, Elena allowed herself to breathe easier. She washed the sweat from his brow, changed the bandages, and tried not to think too much about the unease that coiled in her stomach. By the 3rd evening, he was awake enough to sit propped against the wall. The shadows from the fire flickered across his features, high cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, eyes that gleamed with quiet intensity. He had the kind of face that carried both youth and age, no more than 30 perhaps, but scarred by years of violence. He had yet to say more than a handful of words. "What's your name?" Elena asked, breaking the silence as she ground herbs in a small clay bowl. His eyes flicked to her, then away. He said nothing, she pressed. "If I'm to care for you, I ought to know what to call you." His lips curled, not in a smile but something colder, something that made her fingers falter on the pestle. Still, no answer came. Elena set her jaw. She had dealt with stubborn patients before, cowhands who thought it unmanly to admit to pain, soldiers who treated her like a servant until they realized she was the only thing standing between them and the grave. But this silence was different. It was deliberate, calculating, as though he measured each word and chose to give none. At last she sighed. "Then I'll call you stranger until you decide otherwise." For a moment, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes, quickly gone. Days passed. His strength returned quicker than she expected. He began moving about the cabin, slow at first, then with startling agility. Elena caught him one morning standing near the window, his posture taut as a hunting cat, eyes scanning the horizon. He moved like someone who expected enemies to appear at any moment. "Sit down before you tear your stitches," she scolded, wiping her hands on her apron. He ignored her, fingers tightening against the windowsill. Only when she stepped closer did he finally ease back to the bed, though the set of his jaw told her it was his choice, not hers. It was in these small moments that fear began to creep into her heart. He never asked about her name, her work, or the place he had woken in. He never thanked her. His silence was not that of a grateful patient, but of a man who carried secrets too heavy to share. One evening, As she prepared stew, she noticed his wrist again. The leather band with its tiny beads glinted in the firelight. She had seen such things before on travelers passing through town, and once on the arm of a soldier who boasted he'd cut it from an Apache scout. The memory struck her like cold water. Her hand trembled, spilling herbs across the table. The thought lingered, gnawed at her, refused to be pushed aside. Was the man she had saved one of them? The very people whispered about in town, the ones mothers warned their children of, the ones blamed for raids and killings across the territory? She told herself she was imagining things. After all, he was only a wounded man, a stranger whose life now rested in her hands. But every time his eyes locked with hers, dark, unflinching, holding something wild she could not name, Elena felt the desert itself shift beneath her feet. She had taken in a stranger, yes. But what manner of man she had bound to her home, she could not yet say. Elena rarely went into town unless she had to, but with the stranger sleeping soundly for the first time since she'd brought him home, she decided it was safe enough to make the trip. Supplies were running thin, and she needed flour, salt, and bandages. More than that, she needed to shake off the restless thoughts that had plagued her ever since she'd noticed the beads on his wrist. The trail into town wound through pale sandstone cliffs and dry washes, every step of her mule's hooves echoing against stone. She tried to focus on the list in her head, but her mind kept circling back to the stranger. His silence, his eyes, the way he seemed always alert. Even in weakness, it all unsettled her. By the time she reached the dusty main street, the town was already stirring. Merchants called from doorways, a blacksmith hammered away in his shop, and a group of cowhands loitered outside the saloon. Elena dismounted, tying her mule at the post outside the general store. Inside, she was greeted with the warm smell of coffee and tobacco. Mr. Caldwell, the storekeeper, nodded at her from behind the counter. "Morning, Miss Elena. Haven't seen you in a spell." "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just need a few things, flour, salt, and if you've any bandages left." As he moved to gather her supplies, two men at the counter lowered their voices, though not enough to keep her from hearing. "They say he's still out there," one muttered. "Saw the smoke from his fire 2 nights back just beyond Dry Creek." "Bah," the other scoffed. "If he was still breathin', the army would have found him by now." "That devil's probably buzzard bones by this point." "No, I heard it straight from Deputy Harlan. Apache warrior, fierce as they come. They call him Kiata. They say he slit 3 troopers' throats before vanishing into the rocks. Man like that don't die easy." The name hung in the air like smoke. Kiata. Elena stiffened, her pulse quickening. She kept her head down, pretending to browse a shelf of jars, though her ears strained for every word. "They say he's a ghost," the first man went on, lowering his voice further. "Silent, fast. You never see him coming till the knife's at your throat. Mothers frighten their children with his name." Mr. Caldwell returned with her parcel, but Elena's hands shook as she accepted it. She mumbled her thanks, paid quickly, and hurried out of the store before the men could notice her pallor. The ride home felt longer than usual. Each rustle of brush, each vulture circling overhead made her heart thud harder. The whispers followed her all the way back. Kiata, ghost. Fierce as they come. When she reached her cabin, the stranger was awake, sitting by the fire with his injured side bandaged but his posture taut and alert. His eyes snapped to her the moment she entered. "You were gone long," he said quietly. His voice was stronger now, smooth but carrying an edge like a drawn blade. "I went to town," she answered, setting the parcel on the table. She tried to keep her tone steady, but she could feel his gaze searching her face, as though he could peel the truth straight from her skin. He said nothing, only watched. Elena busied herself with putting away the supplies, but her thoughts churned. The name Kiata rang in her skull like a bell. Could it be coincidence? Or had she dragged into her home the very warrior men whispered about with dread? That night, as the fire died low, she lay awake on her cot across the room, listening to his breathing. It was steady, strong now. Too strong for someone who had been half dead days ago. He was healing quickly, dangerously quickly. In the darkness, the beads on his wrist caught the faint glow of the embers. She could almost hear the voices from town. A ghost, a killer, fierce as they come. Elena rolled onto her side, heart pounding. She had saved a man's life. But had she also invited death into her home? The desert outside lay silent, vast, and indifferent. Inside, the stranger slept like a predator conserving strength, and Elena knew the peace of her quiet life was already beginning to crack. The days grew shorter, the desert nights colder. Elena wrapped herself in her shawl as she sat by the fire, grinding herbs, trying to steady her nerves. Ever since that trip to town, the whispers clung to her like burrs. Kiata. The name followed her even here, in the silence of her cabin. The stranger had grown stronger. Too strong, too fast. His wound should have kept him weak for weeks, yet he moved with a vigor that unsettled her. She caught him testing his arm one morning, rotating it slowly, wincing at the pull of the stitches but refusing to relent. By evening, he was standing without her help, shoulders straight, eyes sharp as an eagle's, and always. He watched not in the way of a grateful patient, but like a man who measured everything, the distance from door to window, the strength of the beams, the weight of her footsteps across the floor. He watched her, too. Every movement, every word. She had the sense he could predict her thoughts before she spoke them. One afternoon, while she prepared broth, she heard a steady rasping sound behind her. Turning, she froze. The stranger sat cross-legged near the fire, a whetstone in his hand. Across his knees lay a long knife, its blade catching the firelight as he drew the stone along it in deliberate strokes. SHHK. SHHK. The sound set her teeth on edge. You shouldn't be straining yourself, Elena said, forcing her voice into something like calm. His eyes lifted to hers, unreadable. A man is never too weak to keep his blade sharp. The words chilled her more than the cold draft slipping through the cracks of the cabin walls. She turned back to her pot, trying to ignore the way the rasping continued, steady as a heartbeat. That evening, after he had eaten, she found herself staring again at the band of leather on his wrist. The beads glimmered in the firelight, each one carefully carved, arranged in a pattern she could not decipher. But she remembered what she'd overheard in town, the Chin, soldier who once bragged about taking such a band from an Apache scout. Her hand tightened around her spoon. She wanted to ask. She wanted to demand his name, to force the truth from his lips. Yet when she opened her mouth, the weight of his gaze stopped her cold. It was the gaze of a man who had lived by steel and silence, and she knew instinctively that pressing him now would be a mistake, later. When the fire was low and she lay awake, she heard movement. Slowly, quietly, she turned her head. The stranger was not sleeping. He stood barefoot near the door, every line of his body tense, listening to the night. His hand rested on the knife at his hip. When had he strapped it there? She hadn't seen him carry it before. Elena held her breath, afraid to move, afraid even to close her eyes. The desert outside was still, yet he stood as if enemies lurked just beyond the walls. Minutes passed, long and heavy, before he finally relaxed, returning to his bed. The next morning, she tried to shake it off, tried to treat him as she would any patient. But the fear gnawed deeper. He was no ordinary man. She saw it in the way he carried himself, in the scars crisscrossing his skin, in the deliberate silence that seemed less weakness and more choice. It was confirmed when she stepped outside to fetch water. A rattlesnake coiled near the barrel, its tail buzzing a warning. Elena froze, heart hammering. Before she could cry out, a flash of movement cut the air. The The stranger's knife struck true, pinning the snake through the head. Elena gasped, stumbling back. He had moved with such speed, such precision. She hadn't even seen him rise. He retrieved the blade calmly, wiping it on the dirt before sliding it back into its sheath. His eyes met hers across the yard, and in them she saw no apology, only the quiet certainty of a man born to kill. "You shouldn't go alone," he said. Simply, Elena swallowed hard, nodding, though she could not find her voice. That night, she sat awake again, staring at the beads on his wrist, at the scars on his body, at the silent man she had saved from death. She no longer wondered if he was the warrior the town whispered about. She wondered only how long until his truth reached her doorstep and what would happen when it did. The desert had a way of swallowing sound at night, turning every whisper of wind into something sinister. Elena lay restless on her cot, listening to the crackle of the dying fire. The stranger stronger now, his body healed far more quickly than it should have, slept near the door, his knife close at hand. She had grown used to the quiet intensity of his presence, but not to the sense that he was waiting for something. That night, she discovered he was right. The first noise was soft hoofbeats muffled against the sand. Her eyes snapped open. The second came sharper, the click of metal. A careless laugh carried through the cold air. Elena's blood froze. Raiders. She sat upright, heart hammering. Before she could rise, the stranger's hand shot up, signaling her to stay silent. His eyes were open, already awake, already alert. He had sensed them before she had. Slowly, silently, he moved to his feet, knife in one hand, the other bracing against the wall for balance. The knock on the door never came. Instead, the wood shuddered as a boot slammed against it, splintering the frame. Another kick, and the latch gave way, the door bursting inward. 3 men stormed in, dusty, unshaven, their eyes glinting with greed. "Well now," one sneered, spotting Elena. "Looks like we found ourselves a prize." Before Elena could cry out, the stranger moved. It was not the staggering effort of a wounded man. It was the fluid grace of a predator unleashed. He closed the distance in a blur, knife flashing. The first raider fell with a gurgling cry, clutching his throat as blood sprayed across the dirt floor. The second lunged, swinging a rusted pistol. The stranger ducked, his blade slicing across the man's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and in the same motion, he drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing against the wall. The third raider hesitated. That hesitation cost him. The stranger's knife buried itself in his chest with such force the man staggered backward, gasping, before collapsing in the doorway. Elena could not move. She pressed her back against the wall, breath caught in her throat. It had all happened in seconds, too fast, too brutal for her to process. One moment her home was under siege. The next, 3 men lay dead or dying at her feet. The stranger stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, blood dripping from his blade. His eyes burned like embers in the firelight, cold, unyielding, utterly fearless. For the first time, Elena understood why men whispered his name like a curse. He turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low, steady, as though he had not just slaughtered 3 men in front of her. Elena shook her head, unable to speak. Without another word, he bent, wiping his blade on one raider's coat before reclaiming it. He moved methodically, checking each body, ensuring none would rise again. His efficiency terrified her more than the violence itself. This was no desperate defense, no panicked fight for survival. This was a man in his element, honed by countless battles. When he was finished, he dragged the bodies outside, one by one, leaving crimson trails in the dirt. Elena followed only as far as the doorway, clutching her shawl around her trembling shoulders. The desert wind carried the copper tang of blood. Mingling with the sagebrush dot, the stranger dumped the bodies beyond the ridge, out of sight of her cabin. When he returned, his face was unreadable, his movements calm. He washed the blade in her basin, the water swirling red before he tipped it outside. Elena finally found her voice. You killed them. They came to kill or worse, he replied evenly. I saved you. She wanted to deny it, wanted to rail against the blood soaking her floor. But the truth pressed heavy on her chest. She would be lying in her grave now if not for him. Still, gratitude did not erase the fear curling tight in her stomach. He sat by the fire again, silent, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. Elena sank into her chair, staring at the man she had saved, the man who had, in turn, saved her. An unspoken bond now bound them together. Yet beneath that bond lurked something deeper, darker. She knew without asking that his hands had ended many lives before tonight. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that hers had not been the first home, too. Echo with death after his arrival. She whispered to herself, though the words were meant for him, "Who are you?" But the stranger gave no answer. The morning after the raid dawned gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Elena sat on the stoop of her cabin, staring at the trail of blood that stained the dirt like a scar. No matter how much water she poured over it, the crimson would not vanish. It seeped into the earth, a permanent reminder. Inside, the stranger tended to the fire as if nothing had happened. His movements were precise, deliberate, every action purposeful. He had said little since the fight. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Only silence. But Elena could not keep silent any longer. She stepped inside. Her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. You killed 3 men in my home. Her voice shook, though she fought to steady it. I deserve to know who you are. The stranger looked up at her. His eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to pierce through her. For a long moment he said nothing, and she thought he would fall back into his maddening silence. Then slowly he spoke. My name, he said, voice low and resonant, is Kiata. The word struck her like a blow. She had heard it only days before, whispered in the general store, carried on men's lips like a curse. Kiata, the Apache warrior. A ghost in the desert. A killer of soldiers. Elena felt the room close in around her. You, she swallowed hard. You're him. His gaze did not waver. Yes. She stumbled back, pressing her hand to her chest as if to steady her heartbeat. The faces of those men in the store flashed in her mind, the fear in their voices as they spoke his name. Mothers frightened their children with his name, slit 3 troopers' throats before vanishing into the rocks. And now he was here, in her cabin, alive because of her hands. I saved you, she whispered, almost to herself. And I saved you, Kiata answered evenly, nodding toward the place where the raiders had fallen. The truth in his words made her falter. Yes, she would be dead if not for him. Yet gratitude warred with terror inside her chest. She could not reconcile the man who drank her broth in, silence with the warrior who slit throats as easily as breathing. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice rising. Why stay here? Why not leave the moment you could walk? For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not anger, not threat. Something deeper, weariness. I had no choice, he said quietly. The soldiers hunted me. I was wounded. If you had not found me, I would have died in the dust. He paused, his jaw tightening. You gave me life. That is a debt I cannot ignore. Elena gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. A debt? In my people, he said, life for life binds us. You saved mine. I saved yours. The balance is not yet even. His eyes held hers, unblinking. Until it is, I remain. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they sent a chill down her spine. Bound? To a feared Apache warrior whose very name made grown men shudder? She turned away, staring at the fire, its flames snapping like restless spirits. Part of her wanted to order him out, to cast him back into the desert and be done with him. But another part, the part that remembered the raiders' faces twisted in cruelty, the part that had seen his blade move faster than her eyes could follow, knew she could not. Kiata was dangerous. But he was also her protector now, whether she wished it or not. That night, as she lay in bed, she could not sleep. His name echoed in her mind, heavy as a curse. Kiata. She turned the beads he had left on her table over and over in her hands, each one polished smooth by years of wear. She had saved a stranger. Now she sheltered a legend one feared, one hated, one hunted. And whether she liked it or not, her fate had been bound to his the moment she dragged his broken body from the arroyo. Elena closed her eyes, a single truth sinking deep into her bones. Her life would never again belong solely to her. Not with Kiata under her roof. The days that followed stretched long and uneasy. Kiata remained in her cabin, silent more often than not, but always aware, always watchful. Elena found herself moving differently around him, slower, quieter, as though every sound might stir some hidden violence in him. And yet, she also found herself studying him, not just the blade in his hand or the scars across his body, but the man beneath them. He rose with the sun, standing at the door to watch the desert wake. He mended what he could of her tools, repaired the mule's tack with a skillful hand, gathered wood without needing to be asked. He was not idle and never wasteful. His presence filled the cabin, but not with chaos. Instead, it was with an unspoken discipline, as though even the simplest tasks were part of some larger code. One morning, Elena noticed his hand linger on the leather band at his wrist. The beads glimmered in the dawn light, and something in the way he touched them softened his otherwise implacable face. "Those beads?" she asked cautiously. What did they mean? For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "They are my mother's. Each bead, a story. A life." She held her breath, afraid to break the fragile thread of words. Stories of what? He turned to her then, and for the first time she saw not just the warrior, but the man. His eyes carried grief so heavy it weighed the air between them. Of those taken, those lost. Each bead, a name I will not let the world forget. Elena lowered her gaze, shame creeping through her. She had feared those beads, imagined them as trophies, proof of his violence. Instead, they were memory, mourning. She felt a sting in her chest that she could not name. That night, as they sat by the fire, she dared to ask another question. Why do they fear you so much? Kiata's jaw tightened, the shadows deepening across his face. Because I do not bow, he said simply. Because I fight when others run. To the soldiers, to the settlers, I am a ghost with a knife in the dark. To my people, I am only a man who refuses chains. His words unsettled her, yet also struck something inside her, a truth she had not expected. She had always known the world was cruel, that power was wielded without mercy. But hearing it from him, spoken with neither pride nor shame, only certainty, made her see him differently. Still, the fear remained. That same evening, as she reached for the kettle, her hand slipped, spilling hot water across her wrist. She hissed in pain, pulling back. Before she could move, Kiata was at her side, faster than she thought possible. He took her hand gently, his touch surprisingly careful, and guided her to sit. He crushed leaves from her herb store, applying them to the burn with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," she murmured, watching his large hands move with a healer's patience. "I have tended many wounds," he said. His voice was quieter now, almost human in its warmth. "Mine and others." For a moment she forgot to breathe. This was not the ghost, the killer, the shadow men feared. This was simply a man, scarred and weary, who carried more than just a blade. Their eyes met, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them: gratitude, respect, perhaps even the faintest spark of understanding. But just as quickly, the moment broke. Kiata released her hand, retreating back to his place by the fire, his face once more unreadable. The wall between them stood firm, though a crack had opened. Elena sat awake long after he had fallen asleep. She turned the moment over and over in her mind, the gentleness of his touch, the weight of his words, the humanity he had let slip through. Fear still lingered. But alongside it now grew something else, something more dangerous than dread: trust. Fragile, tentative, but they're all the same. And she knew it was only a matter of time before that fragile thread would either save her or break her completely. The desert morning was still, the air cool before the sun began its climb. Elena woke to silence, the kind that pressed against her ears, heavy and expectant. For a moment she thought Kiata still slept, as he often did by the hearth, his knife close to hand. But when she turned, the space was empty. Her heart lurched. She rose quickly, scanning the cabin. His bedroll had been neatly folded. The corner where he kept the woodpile was stacked high, fuller than she had left it. Even her tools, shovels, buckets, the mule's worn bridle had been repaired with care. All of it silent evidence of a man preparing to leave. She stepped outside, her shawl clutched around her shoulders. The desert stretched wide before her, the horizon still painted in soft hues of pink and gold. And there he was, standing by her mule, fastening the straps of a small satchel across his back. "You're leaving," she said, the words sharper than she meant. Kiata turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise in his face, only calm acceptance. "It is time." Elena's throat tightened. She had known this moment would come, yet the finality of it cut deeper than she expected. "Where will you go?" He looked toward the ridges, where the land rolled into endless stone and sky. "Away from here. The soldiers still hunt me. If I remain, they will come. You have already risked too much." She took a step closer, anger and fear tangling inside her. "And what of your debt? You said you owed me life for life, that we were bound." A faint shadow crossed his face, not quite a smile, not quite sorrow. "The debt is paid. You saved me. I saved you. Balance has been given." Elena's chest ached. She wanted to argue, to tell him that saving her from raiders was not the same as repaying the life she had dragged back from death in the arroyo. But she saw in his eyes that he would not be swayed. His code was his own, and he would not bend it, not even for her. He reached into his satchel then, pulling free the leather band from his wrist. The beads glinted softly in the rising sun as he held it out to her. Elena froze. "I can't take that." "You will," he said firmly. "It carries stories, memory, a piece of me. So long as it remains with you, I am not forgotten." Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The leather was worn smooth, warm from his skin. She stared at it, the weight of it pressing against her palm. "Why give this to me?" His gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. "Because you saw the man, not the name." The word struck her harder than any blade. She wanted to speak, to say something that might bridge the chasm between them, but her tongue failed her. All she could do was clutch the band to her chest as if it might steady her racing heart. Kiata turned then, stepping into the desert. His movements were quiet, purposeful, every line of him a shadow against the rising light. He did not look back. Elena stood at the edge of her cabin until he vanished beyond the ridge, the horizon swallowing him whole. Only the silence remained, broken by the soft whistle of the morning wind. She looked down at the beads in her hand, each one carved with care, each one holding a story she could never fully know. To the world he would remain a ghost, a feared warrior whispered about in saloons and barracks. But to her, he would always be the man who lay dying in the arroyo, who watched the horizon like it was his last tether to life, who saved her when death came to her door. She had healed his wounds. He had left her with something deeper, an ache she could not name, and a reminder that even the fiercest legends are flesh and blood beneath their scars. As the sun climbed higher, Elena fastened the leather band around her own wrist. The beads were cool against her skin, a secret weight she would carry. She whispered his name once softly into the wind. Kiata. The desert gave no answer, but she knew it remembered.